May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. When raising a child, one is often given the advice to get them into a routine. This provides stability, predictability, and therefore comfort, and makes that time a little less of a surprise. And as adults, we also fall into routines. I bet we all have one or several. I know I have a work day morning routine to get out of the door in some semblance of having my act together, but I also have a weekend morning routine, which I thoroughly enjoy. There's the wrapping up the day at the end of the office routine. There's even the going to bed routine. So basically, I clearly haven't evolved very far from being a child. And clearly that's just me. I'm sure none of you have your own routines. Routines also apply to the way we might see our lives. We believe that there's some kind of a preset plan. We go to school, we graduate, we head off to some form of education, get a job, maybe get married, buy a house, maybe have kids. It's what many see as the standard routine for a life. The challenge is that routines sometimes become rigid. We find that being flexible when we have to get up earlier to take someone to the airport or make it to an early breakfast with a friend is a little bit harder because it's not part of our routine. We might not take a risk because it's not part of the plan we thought we had for our life. It's not the norm. And why do we do that? Well, because routines are stable, predictable, and provide comfort. We know what's expected, and we know what comes next. There's not a big surprise. Routines also apply on a social scale. The way that we interact with one another, the views we have of the world, the expectations we have, the pace at which we move in our lives. And if you find that hard to believe, I'll just say the words global pandemic to prove my point. Perhaps nothing made us so aware of simple social routines than the disruption of them. We could think of these societal routines as norms. The disruption of our social and personal routines can be extremely challenging. Remember, we like routines because they are stable, predictable, and comfortable. So when something or someone breaks that pattern, it stuns us. I think we may all have had that experience when we hear about someone we know going way off the beaten path, to start a school in some foreign country, to sell everything and live off the land in Montana, or quit a successful career and start something new. These steps outside of the norm grab our attention because they're so outside of our typical standard routine. So imagine the break of societal routine or norms that Abram made by following the direction of God to leave his home to go to the land of Canaan, and to believe in God's promise that he and his wife Sarai, his aged, barren wife, would be the founders of nations. I'm sure his neighbors thought he was off his rocker. And what did Paul's colleagues think when he, in our letter today, the epistle, made the audacious declaration that by being followers of Jesus, all Christians were part of Abraham and Sarah's chosen people. Until that point, only Jewish people who followed the law were seen as being the inheritors of that covenant. Paul upended this routine thought with his amazing truth. We are all part of God's people through faith. And then we have our gospel reading. Jesus is clearly a perception smasher, routine breaker, sitting with tax collectors and others who were seen as unclean was a radical thing for someone called a rabbi to do. It was not the norm, and it was absolutely not the routine social standard held by the Jewish people. But Jesus followed God's voice that said these were the people he should be with. The woman who was hemorrhaging was also in that category of the unclean. And And she took a huge risk of touching a man and making him unclean, least of all someone who was a leader and a teacher. It could have resulted in her being severely punished, but she had faith and followed that belief to take an incredible action. And finally, there's the leader of the synagogue whose daughter had died. And somehow he believed that Jesus could bring her back to life. And he did. Talk about disrupting our standard expected routines. These breaks of societal norms have three things in common: listening to the call of God's voice, holding the extraordinary faith required to follow where it leads, and changing the world of those involved. It takes insurmountable courage and strength to ignore the naysayers and focus on where you know your path is leading, especially if it doesn't meet with others' beliefs or norms. How do we know that it's God's voice calling us to do the thing outside the norm? Well, that's something called discernment. And it means getting quiet with yourself, praying for God's guidance, honing in on where you feel that pull, and then testing it to make sure that it's from God, not someone else's expectations directing you. We all have that still small voice inside us that I believe is God-given. And when we get quiet and listen, it will help us know how to step out on to unknown paths. The examples we've heard of amazing faith today, of listening to God's guidance and following where God leads, are strong reminders for us not to get too set in our routines, to hold space for the unexpected, the unpredictable, and the amazing. So my dear friends, and especially those of you beginning new adventures, I encourage you to be brave. Listen for the path God is leading you to. Don't be afraid of breaking out of your routines, pushing the limits of the norm, or being seen as just a little crazy, because that is how we change the world.